Hello and welcome back to another episode of Creedal. I'm joined today by Shaun Blanchard, who has a lot of interesting things to say about the church today, especially in the light of Pope Francis's motu proprio, Traditionis Custodes, the debates around Vatican II, all of these things. So I'm thrilled to welcome him on. I had not known Shaun until just a few months ago when he reached out after one of my conversations with Larry Chat and said, hey, really enjoyed the discussion. We should maybe chat about some stuff sometime. And I said, let's do it. Would love to have you on the podcast. And he sent me some things that he's written, which are really, really interesting. We'll dive into some of those. But Shaun, I'm delighted to welcome you on to Creedal.
Thanks so much, Zach. You also interviewed my good friend in Baton Rouge, Father Josh Johnson. So
that's right.
I listened to that. I was on a treadmill next to him listening to it.
Oh, nice. You guys workout buddies?
Yeah, he got me back in the gym. He said,
Great.
Look, man, all this barbecue, all this fried chicken, you need a gym membership. So
you got to work it off. Absolutely.
So
yeah,
on January 3rd or 4th, I joined him in the gym.
Nice.
It's great. It's wonderful. I mean, you have it's kind of the crossroads of, it doesn't have the amazing tradition that you get in New Orleans or in Lafayette, the kind of Creole, cosmopolitan stuff in New Orleans, and then you get the Cajun in Lafayette, but it's kind of the crossroads of both of those. So you can get everything in Baton Rouge.
That's great. So is Father Josh your parish priest there?
In a sense, yes. My wife and I normally go to Christ the King, which is essentially the Newman Center for LSU.
Got it.
The pastor there is another great young now is under 40 to me.
Yeah. Right.
So Father Andrew Merrick, who's fantastic. And then his very close friend is Father Josh, who lives there and helps out, but is also vocations director.
Got it.
So he's essentially like a parochial vicar.
Very cool.
Type deal, yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, let me read your bio to our listeners here, just so they get a sense of who you are and where you're coming from. Shaun Blanchard is a senior research fellow at the National Institute for Newman Studies in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a graduate of the University of North Carolina, University of Oxford, and Marquette University. Shaun writes on a variety of topics in early modern and modern Catholicism. He is the author of the Synod of Pistoia and Vatican II, and I hope we can talk about the Synod of Pistoia today, Shaun, because that's really interesting to me. And with Ulrich Lehner, co-edited the Catholic Enlightenment, a Global Anthology, which was published by CUA last year. Forthcoming works include a monograph study of the ecclesiology in the English-speaking world, an anthology of Jansenist sources, which is co-edited with Richard Yoder, and Vatican II, a very short introduction, co-authored with Stephen Bullivant. And as we just mentioned, Shaun lives in Baton Rouge with his wife Anne-Marie and loves cats, fried chicken sandwiches, and English beer. Shaun's devotion to the University of North Carolina's football team has taught him more about eschatological hope than any of his theological study. And if you're following along at home but are not really a football fan, let me just say that the University of North Carolina is perennially bad at football.
Mediocre. I would challenge bad.
Yeah, okay, that's fair. That's fair. You had some bright spots in the Mitch Trubisky era.
We did.
Although he hasn't had many bright spots since.
It's
then.
It's enough hope to break your heart. Is how it works. I have this, but I wanted to be more professional and not wear it during we're gearing up for March Madness.
I was going to say, are you ready for March Madness?
Yeah. Carolina basketball right now is good but not great, and we're normally, I was very spoiled. I was at Carolina from 05 to 09 or 06, fall of 05. So we won senior year of high school, we won the national championship senior year of college. So nice. I lived through the true glory years, so I'm a little more patient with the struggles we're having now.
That's totally fair. Yeah, I'm an Eagles fan in the NFL. And we're perpetually sort of on the bubble. And obviously a few years ago won the Super Bowl. And
that was awesome.
I feel like as a sports fan, I can now die happy because my favorite sports team finally won.
That was a wonderful game. And you had Mac Hollins on your team for a while.
I know, that's right, from UNC.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was bummed when we let him go. I've always been a Mac Hollins fan. Yeah,
he's
pretty cool. Very interesting guy, too. He has like this reptile hobby, loves keeping snakes and stuff. It's very kind of strange, but
He was a walk-on. He was mailing VHS tapes of his highlights to coaches.
I didn't know that part about VHS tapes.
Yeah, he's a phenomenal success story. Wow. Yeah, absolutely.
That's cool. Well, Shaun, thanks for coming on. I'm very excited to talk to you. I was really glad when you reached out. And when we had some follow-on discussions, you mentioned you had this essay forthcoming about Vatican II, and it looks like it's out now in Commonweal. It is called "The Reform Was Real: Continuity and Change at Vatican II." I will put this in the show notes for anyone who wants to read and follow along. But Shaun, let's use this as a launching point for our discussion
Sure.
today. We can obviously talk about anything else you've written, and I do want to talk about the Synod of Pistoia. But as maybe a sort of starting point for what you're talking about here, you are saying that there was real discontinuity at Vatican II. Not that it was all discontinuity, not that there was rupture, if we can sort of contrast that with the hermeneutic of rupture. But you're saying there was discontinuity, and we need to sort of call this discontinuity for what it is and recognize that discontinuity is sometimes an important part of the development of doctrine. And as one of the sort of chief champions of your case, you cite Benedict XVI, who, as Pope and as Cardinal Ratzinger before he was Pope, talked about this very type of discontinuity that you are saying Vatican II constituted. So let's talk about that maybe as a first question. What would you say is the difference between the hermeneutic of reform and the hermeneutic of rupture? And how should we understand that hermeneutic of reform, possibly including this discontinuity that we were talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm gonna answer it very briefly, and then we can extrapolate on it in kind of in whatever direction. But I mean, very briefly, I would say a hermeneutic of rupture would be a theologically irresponsible way to explain change, either in church history or church teaching. And obviously, the focal point of the reason these phrases were coined was specifically Vatican II, but I think they have broader applicability. A hermeneutic of reform, and this might seem like question begging, right? Because reform is a good word, rupture is a bad word, but a hermeneutic of reform is a responsible way to explain change in church history or church teaching. So hermeneutics of rupture, and I know we're going to get into this later, they could be on kind of either end of the spectrum, if you will, a more traditionalist rupture or a more progressive rupture. And I think that's the origin of the concern that Pope Benedict, or we should maybe call him Ratzinger, because we're talking about his longer career. But Ratzinger was concerned with both of those possibilities.
Yeah, that makes sense. So when we say hermeneutic of rupture, when people say, or it's probably less claimed by people who embrace this, that they are embracing a hermeneutic of rupture. I think more likely it's an accusation that you're embracing a hermeneutic of rupture. So when someone casts that sling stone at someone, what are they actually claiming? What does hermeneutic of rupture mean?
I think it would never be used positively, as you say, right? Someone might say, I believe in reform, or I believe in healthy change or something. People aren't going to say rupture. Perhaps maybe some progressives would say Vatican II was revolutionary, and by that they would mean something that Ratzinger would categorize as rupture. But I think the theological problem would be a break. I mean, Ratzinger's phrase was what is it? The one. Let me hear. I had it pulled up. He uses a phrase, the one subject church. Yeah. So he says, a hermeneutic of renewal in the continuity of the one subject church which the Lord has given to us. So this is what he's trying to guard against, is maybe, to use the language of today, a great reset. What he's trying to say, Vatican II was not a great reset. It doesn't throw out everything that happened before it. Either from whether you come from a traditionalist perspective and you're lamenting this, what a horrible thing that Vatican II destroyed our faith, or from a progressive perspective, what a wonderful thing, we can leave all that stuff in the trash and we can move on to this this new reality that we're living in. So he's really trying to, from his perspective, he's walking a narrow road in between two possibilities, which break a sense of a kind of continual journey. And I think, Vatican II's ecclesiology, with this idea of the pilgrim church journeying through history, that's a very much a continuous image. It's a subject that can change in positive ways and can reform and renew, but it is a continuous march, if you will, a continuous journey. So that's what I think John Paul II and Ratzinger were on the same page, even though they very much embraced many things that would be identified with the spirit of Vatican II in all kinds of areas. they were very concerned with saying this is the same church that we had at Pentecost and that we had at the Council of Chalcedon and through the ages. That
Right.
was a preoccupation.
So I often hear the hermeneutic of rupture contrasted with the hermeneutic of continuity. What you're advocating in your article is that the hermeneutic of reform is not strictly speaking a hermeneutic of continuity. Yes, it is certainly, as you just mentioned, emphasizing that this is the same church that we had at Pentecost and Chalcedon and Nicaea, etc. But a hermeneutic of reform definitionally, I think, includes elements of both continuity because it is the same thing reformed, but also discontinuity because it is indeed reformed. There's something changed in it. So the hermeneutic of reform, then, if I understand you correctly, differs from the hermeneutic of continuity because reform is not strict continuity. There are obviously changes between what is formed and what is reformed. So a hermeneutic of reform contains elements of continuity and discontinuity simultaneously. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. So I think we saw a change in the way that Ratzinger spoke about this. In 1985, he talks about a hermeneutic of discontinuity and rupture, and then he talks about a hermeneutic of continuity. So he does use the phrase hermeneutic of continuity in 1985. I think he realized in 2005 that he had been misunderstood, and I think he realized that there were people who were taking him to mean the proper interpretation of Vatican II involves no real change other than maybe a new pastoral strategy.
Right.
New rhetoric, maybe some obviously disciplinary change. Everyone would accept that there was disciplinary change, whether they celebrate or bemoan that, or a mixture of the two, as I think I would do. I need more than anyone. I need meatless Fridays. I need some form of a regular penitential
Right.
Discipline because
Yeah.
I'm much better. I'm a convert too, like you, and I'm much better at feasting than fasting. So they're perhaps a mixed bag. But anyway, I'm getting off track. Everyone would accept there was some level of change, but I think Ratzinger realized that he'd been misunderstood with the hermeneutic of continuity. That there could be no that teaching as such had not changed in any way.
Right.
And I think there's a couple things going on in this 2005 address. There's a great article by a French-Canadian theologian named Gilles Routier, like Giles, Gilles Routier. And he sees this address as basically aimed at SSPX, as basically trying to justify, yes, there was change in the teaching on religious liberty, which SSPX has always insisted.
Rejected.
This is change, and we can't accept it for that reason. So Ratzinger's Pope Benedict is trying to say, he's not trying to gaslight them and say, no, there's no change. Don't mind the man behind the curtain. He's being very honest. There is real change here, and it's justifiable for these reasons. So I think that's one of the goals, the kind of undercurrent. He doesn't come out and say, hey, this is aimed at SSPX, but I think he's trying to say, by continuity, I'm trying to give a theological, but when I said hermeneutic of continuity, I never meant that to exclude reform, and reform can include continuity and discontinuity, but he does say at different levels.
Right.
So he still is very much guarding against what he would see as this progressivist rupture hermeneutic as well.
Now, when he says at different levels, is he saying that there can only be continuity on the level of dogma, for example, but there can be discontinuity on the lower level of doctrine?
Yes, I mean, I think the only qualification I would put to saying continuity in dogma would simply be that dogma can develop and there can be clarity, but there cannot be reversal.
Yes.
I think that would be insisted. I mean, I think all mainstream Catholic theologians, certainly the popes, would insist dogma as such could never be reversed because we believe dogma with divine and Catholic faith. And that's integral to our salvation. So when Ratzinger cites John the 23rd and Paul the Sixth and these his predecessors on that question, he is very much saying Vatican II does not. I don't know if I'd even want to say it doesn't alter dogma because again, an alteration could be clarity, right?
Right.
So there's nothing wrong with that. I think essentially everyone would accept that that's possible, but it doesn't drop or reverse dogma. But it could drop or reverse a non-definitive doctrine, and even one that has been held for a very long time. And that, I think, that is the middle ground that is very controversial right now in the kind of wider Catholic conversation. So Yves Congar, for example, says true reform does not touch dogma, but it has to extend beyond discipline, better regulate, canonical enforcement. But that middle ground, that's where the debate is, and that's the really, really hard part. So stuff like Pope Francis with the death penalty. The debate, the critics of Pope Francis would say, well, this is definitive doctrine. This can't be altered. Yeah. The supporters would say, whatever he's doing, it's touching non-definitive doctrine.
Yeah.
Same thing for religious liberty, amoris laetitia, all these controversial moves.
So, as an example, Pius IX dogmatically defined the assumption of the Immaculate Conception, right? The Immaculate Conception is now the level of definitive dogma. It cannot be reversed. There could be future clarifications about the Immaculate Conception, perhaps, possibly, with respect to our Eastern brethren and some of the different understandings of original sin. Perhaps, I don't know. I'm speculating at this point, but
absolutely.
There could be clarifications in the future.
That's a great example. The theological understanding of what those things mean could be debated and clarified. Yeah.
Right. But there could not be a future council that overturns that or reverses the dogma of the Immaculate Conception. But another example that could be maybe or was perhaps, I think in the Syllabus of Errors, which is also Pius IX, and correct me if any of my history is wrong here, I think he pointed out that there is no sort of right to religious freedom.
Right. That's right.
And Benedicts who said no, there is, right? So that would be the example of the discontinuity on a different level that Benedict's talking about, that the Society of St. Pius X takes major issue with, that even today Bishop Athanasius Schneider takes major issue with, etc.
That's right. Yeah.
And Benedict XVI is saying, no, this is a legitimate development of doctrine, and it can be changed in this way because this is not dogmatically defined.
That's right. And he would also, that's a great example, and the distinction is really important. And this distinction gets lost on a lot of people, and they think that if you talk about doctrinal change, you're just saying, well, everything's up for grabs, and tomorrow we might say that the Trinity is a quadernity, or something like this.
Yeah.
And this is not at all what after Vatican II. There were a number of debates amongst the council fathers of the quote unquote majority. So you have Yves Congar, Joseph Ratzinger, Hans Küng, Henri de Lubac. They have very intense debates, but none of them are debating, can non-definitive doctrine change? It had changed. They all accepted that it had. The question was, how do we move forward? What is a healthy amount of change? How do we justify this change? What else is debatable or not debatable? And I think for Ratzinger, as an individual, there was a sense that there's an airing of ideas and grievances at an ecumenical council that is inappropriate after an ecumenical council.
Right.
So his tone changes. There's a number of reasons that his tone changed, but one reason is, we just did that, guys. We put a lot on the table. There's a lot going on, and we need to kind of consolidate at this point. Mm-hmm. And he had conversation partners that did not agree with that. But what you're saying about the syllabus, I think every mainstream Catholic theologian after the council would have accepted. There are 18th and 19th century teachings in encyclicals or in papal allocutions or what have you that have been superseded. Yeah. And it was only later, when there was a battle between, broadly speaking, conservative and liberal interpretations of the council, that you get a rise of a conservative hermeneutic of continuity, which tries to sort of, I think, kind of historically whitewash all of that. Yeah. And I don't think Ratzinger ever intended to do that, and I think he clarifies that in 2005.
That makes sense. I'm going to read a paragraph excerpt from your article here, Shaun, then we can talk about it a little bit, because I think this helps to maybe take a step back and just look at the camps as perhaps Benedict did, as you suggest. and then we can sort of talk about the problems with each, and then maybe why the hermeneutic of reform is the best way to bridge these gaps between the various parties. This is, I don't know, 10 paragraphs or so into your article, I think. By the 1980s, Ratzinger was known to hold that there were basically three positions on Vatican II. Two of them were erroneous and theologically dangerous, even potentially schismatic. Only one was orthodox. First, Ratzinger impugned a traditionalist hermeneutic that he associated primarily with Archbishop Marcel. And I never remember how to pronounce this guy's name. Is it Lefebvre?
Lefebvre.
Okay. Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre.
I mispronounced it horribly when I first was reading about this, when I was at Oxford, actually, in front of a French person, and they were laughing hysterically. I said Lefebvre or something like that.
Yeah. I think I normally say like Lefebvre or something like that.
All well, right, some say Lefebvre, but I'm pretty sure it's Lefebvre.
Okay.
Yeah.
Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, the founder of the Society of St. Pius X. That's the SSPX that you were talking about. Second was a far more popular progressive hermeneutic that saw Vatican II not as reform, but as revolution, a totally new beginning. And then you have this parenthetical here that I totally resonate with. Some vapid post-conciliar gather hymns I suffered through as a young man sum up this paradigm, e.g. sing a new church into being. I've sung that, or I've been in a church that has sung that, in the past like 2 years. So this is not, this is not.
I can't I can't even sing that stuff. I feel like I'm in like a Care Bear world or something. Yeah. And I'm not a liturgical. I'm not really a traditionalist at all. I mean, I'm perfectly happy to have normal, English masses at the new missal. But some of it's the songs that I can't.
Yeah, it's rough. It's
really
rough.
Handle.
And then you say both of these two paradigms were hermeneutics of discontinuity, unorthodox because they posited a break or rupture in the church's continuous spirit-led journey through history. And you're getting at something here that I've thought a lot about, with respect to the sort of Taylor Marshalls of the world. And that's that it is dangerous, I think, to posit that Vatican II really did embrace a spirit of what we might call total discontinuity. Because if you do that, you're essentially agreeing in substance, although not direction, with those who say, no, this is about a revolution. You're right. Because those two camps are saying there's nothing but discontinuity at Vatican II. One is saying that's why we have to reject Vatican II, and the other is saying that's why Vatican II ushers in this revolution in the church and why we should sing a new church into being, etc.
Right.
And so there's a real danger there, and obviously that needs to be contrasted with this hermeneutic of reform that recognizes no, there's continuity and there's discontinuity. And you need both in reform, and I think that's the crucial insight from Benedict, right?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I think so. Yeah. Benedict was his instincts were very conservative, but he was also, I should say is, he's remarkably still alive and seems to be lucid. His whole concern was, we have to actually be honest about the change that is here. We have to be honest about, I think he saw this as a theological imperative. If we're uniting faith and reason, if Jesus Christ is the truth, sometimes that's really uncomfortable. And sometimes we have to look honestly at the mistakes that we've made in the past, the ways that we've formulated our ideas that are either not ideal or even perhaps wrong in certain circumstances. So I think he saw this as a theological and a historical question.
And how do we sort of evaluate what is up for debate and what is not, right? As we just mentioned, the things that are dogmatically defined are not. But I think you'll even find debates over what has been dogmatically defined.
Right.
And I think there are, for example, there are some things that councils say that are dogmatically defined, and there are other things that you'll find in councils that maybe they're not in canons, for example, and so you can't really make the argument that there are holes in the argument that it's dogmatically defined. One example of this, again, there are some in the sort of hardcore traditionalist circles in America who say that Vatican II defined nothing dogmatically because there are no canons. And so, since that's the case, you actually don't have to accept that because none of it is in the category of dogma, etc. So there are even debates on what is dogmatically defined. I think, and that obviously makes it difficult to understand what can be decided? Maybe this is the sort of difficult gray area of debate that you were just talking about, but
Right.
how do we have any confidence that the things that we hold are going to be fixed and cannot be changed in the future?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and obviously my opinion is just my opinion. You're correct that there is no agreed upon list of infallible statements, and one reason for that is that the definition of papal infallibility itself comes in 1870. So you have this kind of irony of you have a tension between Pope and Council from at least the late Middle Ages that is an explosive tension at the Council of Constance and is there at Trent as well. You then have a definition of papal infallibility in 1870 that uses a particular formula that most people can get on board with, even people that had reservations about defining the dogma of papal infallibility, the Gallican bishops.
Like Newman, I think, for example.
Exactly. Right. So Newman was fine with the notion that the Pope could teach infallibly, but he thought there were various reasons why defining this was what was a problem or imprudent at the very least. So one of the problems is how do you apply a formula that's agreed upon in 1870 back to whatever Boniface VIII in 1302 or Pope Leo in 451 or something like that. So my read of Vatican I is that the real impact of the council is in the definition of the Pope's jurisdictional supremacy. So the Pope can appoint all bishops. The Pope has immediate authority over bishops that can't be blocked by kings or parliaments or national bishops' conferences or whatever it might be. So that's the real very concrete, undeniable takeaway from Vatican I. Papal infallibility works. This is the kind of irony of it to me. It's meant to resolve. Many of the advocates for papal infallibility wanted it to be this immediate ability of the Pope to resolve a dispute. Mm-hmm. Dispute comes up, Pope says X, everyone gets in line. And there's many, many reasons why in 1870 lots of Catholic bishops thought that was a good idea and the correct reading of the tradition and things like that. But that doesn't actually in practice happen. If you look at the two dogmatic definitions that everyone agrees were indeed dogmatic definitions, the Immaculate Conception and the Assumption, are the result of essentially unanimous consent by everyone.
Right.
I mean, very, very few people in 1854 would have denied the Immaculate Conception. There were some. They were descendants of Jansenists called the Macolisti. So there were small groups of folks who denied it, but I mean, less than 1% of Catholics. And I think same thing with the Assumption. Anyone who had a problem with the Assumption had a problem with it because they thought it might be ecumenically insensitive or unnecessary. Right. Nobody... Not because
it was untrue.
Exactly. I mean, I think the piety towards it, and this is one of Newman's insights about this are really beautiful. You have a liturgical tradition, you have the faith of the laity, you have the preaching of bishops, and then this all kind of flowers up into dogma. So all that to say, papal infallibility hasn't, in my reading, historically, has not been successfully exercised apart from consensus. That doesn't mean that it couldn't be. I mean, the definition itself says that it can be, and that was very controversial, apart from the consent of the church. But I think the reading of dogma that is the healthiest and historically and theologically the most defensible is around a kind of consensus. That doesn't mean the church can't teach authoritatively about something that's controversial or that there are dissenting opinions on, but the real monuments of tradition, the real landmarks of tradition are if not unanimous, enjoy widespread consensus at every level. That's my personal opinion. Yeah. But to focus on your question of how do we know? I think it's difficult. You and I could get out a pen and paper and we could write a list of things. And it might be really close. I might write down 40 things and you might write down 45. We're probably right about most of those, but we're probably not going to be sure about whatever is controversial, except in historical hindsight.
Yeah.
So in the 1950s, when John Courtney Murray was challenging the official teaching on religious liberty, there were people who thought he was challenging definitive doctrine, and there were people who thought he was challenging. I mean, it was clearly doctrine; it was clearly teaching.
Yep.
There were people who thought, well, this is ultimately reformable because it has to do with contingent historical things, church-state relations, forms of government. And they thought it should be an open question. Eventually, Murray is vindicated, at least to some extent. There's differing readings of Dignitatis Humanae around, is it more of a French model or the American model? Be that as it may, in hindsight, it's clearly non-definitive. By right, because definitive means final and unalterable. I'm not sure.
Definitive now? I mean, was it non-definitive then and definitive now because now it's been codified in the council?
I think there are. I would hesitate, even though as an American, raised on 4th of July and
that's right,
and founding fathers and all that. I mean, it's hard for me to imagine societies that don't have the kinds of public spaces I'm used to having, and the kinds of civil liberties that I'm used to enjoying. But I think from the perspective of the Catholic faith, I think what I would say is definitive about something like Dignitatis Humanae is insights into human dignity and insights into the right of the human being not to be coerced religiously. I would hesitate, as much as I would like to, as a good flag waving American. I would like to impose my political proclivities as the most Catholic, but I don't think that's fair. And I think that in the year 2500 or 3000 AD, there could be a very, very different understanding of church and state and the civil order, and so there's always going to be non-definitive elements to these documents and these teachings.
That's fair. So how best do you think? I mean, just to take religious freedom, for example, and you talk about exactly how sort of Pope Benedict made an appeal to SSPX about why this was a real change, but it was a necessary and true change. To take that as an example, what do you think is the best way to explain this change to people today, even who say, like I already mentioned Bishop Schneider. I've read his Christus Vincit, his book-length interview with Diane, Catholic reporter. I forget her, Montaigne maybe.
Montaigne, I believe. Yeah.
It's really good. I like a lot of what he says. I mean, some of his memoir, his spiritual memoir, is just beautiful, and his story of growing up in the faith with his parents and his love for Jesus is palpable. But he does reject
under
freedom.
persecution of some form. I believe.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Yeah. Under the Soviet Union, right? Yeah.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And so I think he and his family had to go on a train like 4 hours every Sunday to get to a mass that they could attend. I mean, just a really inspiring story of growing up under Soviet repression. And he clearly loves Jesus very dearly, but he rejects this. He rejects this notion of religious freedom, and he says that there is no right to wrong, basically. And I mean, how do we engage with people like Bishop Schneider, and try to articulate that this is discontinuity, but the discontinuity per se is not a problem, because it's not reversing a previously established dogma, and this obviously has really important implications for how we reach out to the so-called radtrads in our midst, most of whom I think love Jesus dearly, and who I really want to be fully immersed in the church and not sort of put out at the margins. I mean, one of my main concerns with Traditionis Custodes is that it does exactly that. It takes these people who are really trying to be faithful to Christ and His church. Maybe they need some help in sort of understanding what that fidelity looks like, but instead it just casts them out, makes them feel like they're persecuted within their own church. And then it's harder for all of us to benefit from the fruits that they can offer and the gifts that they have. And that's a really hard thing, especially when they see it not happening. And I've talked about this with Larry, which you might have heard. They see it not happening to those who are doing what Larry calls like the clown masses.
Right.
Those people aren't marginalized and put on the periphery. It's the people who are trying to attend the mass of the ages, as they call it, the traditional Latin mass, and be as faithful as they possibly can. So how do we best sort of go forward from here?
Yeah.
And find common ground.
Yeah. Well, let me just sit briefly on this notion of the clown masses. I was in some shocking masses the first couple of years after I became Catholic in 2006.
Yeah.
And I do think quite a lot of that has been stamped out as a violent image, but I do think it's been, and that's just partly because of changing proclivities of priests. And I do think many bishops have made clear that this stuff is not appropriate. And I think most lay people don't actually want this. So I do think we've come a really long way. I talked with Larry about that. I watched your interview with Larry, which is why I emailed you, because I thought it was great. And Larry and I spoke about this a couple weeks ago. I do think we're headed in a positive direction liturgically. I think most people want, maybe we're in different contexts. I mean, I've lived in North Carolina, Wisconsin, Louisiana. Most of what I find is really good. Occasionally there's something nutty, but usually really good. Spent time in Australia, England, Ireland. I think we're headed in the right direction, but as you say, there are problems, and it's not fair to target only the people that are quote unquote to the right of us and give a free pass to problems that we see quote unquote to the left of us. I completely agree with that. Another thing I would say regarding persecution or the perceived persecution, studying Jansenism has really made me. There was a moment where I think there was a possible reintegration of so-called Jansenism, of these people that tended to a more extreme Augustinianism, and it was in the 1780s and 90s, and it was called the Peace of the Church. It really started in the 1670s. 1680s, 1690s. I think there was a window of opportunity, and polemic and tension ramped back up, and then the Pope issues an encyclical, is what we would call it now, called Unigenitus, and this was, I say in an essay, it pours kerosene on a smoldering fire, and I think it made things much worse. I think Unigenitus should not have been promulgated, at least not in the form in which it was, and it created a persecuted church within a church, which had redounded decades and decades and decades, and even contributed in some ways to the French Revolution. So I do think that Rome needs to be very, very careful with how they handle these folks. Very, very careful, not only for the spiritual good of everyone, including the traditionalists, but also for very practical, self-serving reasons. Rome needs to be very, very careful. Regarding how to dialogue with someone like Schneider, I think the most important thing is that understanding the historical context of these teachings. I think that when teaching is presented as all basically the same, the Tome of Leo and the Nicene Creed and all that is teaching, right? It's in the pages of Denzinger, but it's utterly fundamental to who we are as Catholics. There's also stuff in Denzinger, which is Holy Office responses to queries from Leuven University on highly technical, disputed point, about dueling or about, taking interest at various times of history, So there's because of the post-conciliar tension and the ambiguity that a lot of people have felt, there's been a tendency to view doctrine the way that fundamentalist Protestants view Scripture. Right. Catholics instinctively have a sense that's because of the way we're catechized, I think because of the liturgy, we instinctively have a sense that, the Gospels are central. And if something seems to contradict the Gospel, you read that through the Gospel and not the other way around. Right. Okay, so Catholics are not going to say, oh, no, actually, it's okay to annihilate your enemies because look in Joshua chapter 7, they do. No, we right? Yeah. We have even Catholics who've never studied Scripture at a deep level, they have instincts about how to interpret it, and I think that needs to be the case with doctrine as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I think with religious liberty in particular, the way that Pope Benedict justifies it, I think is really beautiful. As he says, well, there's a continuity here with the early church and with Christ, which in some ways was obscured over the centuries. So you can claim a kind of, he talks about claiming a deeper continuity. Mm-hmm. So the Dignitatis Humanae, whatever issues it has and whatever ways it will be reinterpreted throughout the centuries, it's trying to go back to a deeply Christological understanding of the dignity of the person, the freedom of the person to accept or reject the message of the gospel, freedom as a constituent part of love and discipleship. And I think that people like Archbishop Schneider or Bishop Schneider need to read the 18th and 19th century teachings through the broader tradition. So it might sound glib, but we need to be more traditional, not less traditional. Mm-hmm. We need to take into account the entire tradition. Again, easier said than done. People are really dug in to their tribes and their context. And I think the debate over religious liberty is often not really about that. It's really about the question of, well, what else can change? Or do we have to now accept Vatican II as a good thing instead of a bad thing? I think that's the tail wagging the dog for a lot of people, is they want to say, look, Vatican II was a failure. It was bad. Is there some way we can sort of, most people don't go as far as like Vigano says, can we he actually cites the Synod of Pistoia. He says, really? Can we just condemn? Yeah, can we just sort of blot this out the way we did with the Synod of Pistoia, which is kind of silly because that's a diocesan synod, not an ecumenical council. But I think that's the deeper debate. The Dignitatis Humanae became kind of a satellite war, a focal point for what do you think about Vatican II overall.
Right.
And as conservative as Ratzinger was at times in his post-conciliar implementation or understanding, he was doggedly supportive of Vatican II as at least the texts of Vatican II. And I think that's where we've seen in the last couple of years certain conservative forces that were broadly in favor of Ratzinger's pontificate and broadly supportive of him, I think are drifting away from that position now because they go, oh, well, look at Pope Francis. He's the result of all this, beating the drum of Vatican II. It was inevitable we would get a Francis, and now we have to sort of reverse all of this.
Yeah, totally. I think that is exactly the situation in which we find ourselves now. And I think I really value your work, Shaun, because I think it does, it offers us sort of a way of understanding these elements of discontinuity, which are really hard to deny. I mean, I think many people who are in the, and I don't mean this pejoratively, I just mean this as sort of a convenient label, but the rad-trad faction, right? Many people who are there have gotten to this point where maybe they came into the church, and I'm not talking exclusively about Taylor Marshall, but maybe he's a good example. He was an Anglican priest in the Episcopal Church in America. The Episcopal Church, and I know this because I was in the Episcopal Church in America, just went off the rails, just a complete mess in the early 2000s. And so there was an exodus of both clergy and lay people from the Episcopal Church into other denominations. And I think that those would generally go one of three ways. They'd either sort of leave the church entirely because they'd be disillusioned with it, or they would go into a more serious Reformed stream, something like the PCA, for example, or they would become Catholic. And obviously, Taylor Marshall and we became Catholic. So we're in that stream exiting Anglicanism. And Anglicans have a really high view of church authority and ecclesiology. They have an ecclesiology that is not Catholic, of course, but it's more Catholic, more I should say more sort of historical than, for example, Presbyterian ecclesiology. It emphasizes the episcopacy, for example. It has a pretty high view of the sacraments, although it differs on what the sacraments are, et cetera. But it does value authority, and there is even sort of an authority structure in the Anglican Church. There are something like synods or global conferences. There's not really the same understanding of infallible dogma unless you're talking about the early 7 ecumenical councils. But authority is still valued and appreciated. But especially for these Anglicans who were fleeing, authority was really important because the Episcopal Church was, as it was going off the rails, was just proclaiming all of these things to be true that were just completely antithetical to the gospel and to the received tradition as it had been universally understood for almost 2,000 years. So it was a huge problem, and I think those Anglicans who were coming in really wanted to see Rome as a bedrock of authority that would never change. And we were talking about this a little bit before we hit the record button too, is, when you become Catholic, as you're catechized in RCAA or whatever it is, you're kind of taught that. You read like the Catholic Answers tracts, and it's very simple. It's like, the nice thing about the Catholic Church is that it never changes. There's that, I think you even mentioned this article, right? The meme. Where there's like the skeleton meme, and it's like still waiting for the Catholic Church to change.
And I remember being like, when I saw that. And
exactly.
I was like,
you're like, oh, this is exactly what I need. Like, I need an unchanging church. And now there is an element of truth there. Like in one level, the church is indefectible, and on one level, the church never changes. On another level, as Benedict points out, and it is another level, the church changes. It has to change. It changes all the time. It changes because it's made up of defectible people. It's an indefectible institution made up of defectible people. But my broader point here, sorry for the monologue.
No. It's great, man. You're articulating a lot of what I wanted to say, so I appreciate it.
Well, a lot of people like myself, like Taylor Marshall, we come into the Catholic Church and we think this is great. I never have to worry about being sort of slippery on doctrine anymore because the Catholic Church will never change. And then what happens is we start studying history and we realize, it has changed. Like there have been moments, for example, like Vatican II, that contradicted previous papal pronouncements, like Pius IX's syllabus of errors. What do we do with that? I thought this was the church that was never going to change. And I think, I think your work is really helpful for this because it helps us understand, this is why it changed. This is why it changed because, and you mentioned this in the end of your article too, we haven't really covered it yet, but we need to have this approach that does recognize that the church is simultaneously indefectible and defectible, that it has two aspects. It's both divine and human. In her divinity, the church never changes. She's perfect and indefectible. In her humanity, the church has to change because she is led and made up by sinful people. And so in that sense, the people in her can make errors. Now, the sort of more sophisticated understanding recognizes the two levels of the church, that there are levels of her teaching that are dogmatically defined that reflect her indefectibility in essence, and so they cannot be changed. On another level, as these doctrines develop and sometimes not become dogma, those doctrines develop over time and can indeed be changed over time, and that's what we have to recognize. So I think the hard work is recognizing, as you've already pointed out, where those dividing lines are, what can and cannot be reversed. But we have to recognize, just prudentially, that there is true reversal of doctrine sometimes. The true reversal is rare, but there's very frequently alteration and almost always development. And we have to recognize that, because if we don't, then we're going to end up in the place where as soon as we find an example of reversal, it sort of crumbles away our entire epistemological, ecclesiological foundation.
That's right.
And then we're stuck sort of drifting moreless, and we're in a big problem there.
That's right. That's I couldn't agree more. And I think I know less about the Episcopal Anglican context, obviously, than you do. I have some wonderful friends from that tradition, but I've also seen some pretty wild stuff from. I was looking into the Episcopal Church when I was on my journey to Catholicism, and I somehow ended up on an email thing, email forwards of John Shelby Spong, and someone said, he went to UNC Chapel Hill, and I thought, wow, right. And then I read it, and he doesn't believe in the resurrection. He
Jesus,
thinks,
exactly.
And I thought, gosh, this is not, so it's now that's an extreme case, of course. Most Episcopalians, practicing people in that tradition would completely affirm that, but.
Well, most Anglicans would. I'm actually not totally sure if most Episcopalians would, but
I mean, certainly the ones I know would, but maybe that's self-selected in some way. My context in the epistemological thing you're talking about is so important, and it's not just Catholics. I mean, you articulated it on this in our tradition how this manifests, but in the circles I was growing up in, evangelical. On the spectrum of evangelical to fundamentalist, depending on the community and how you would parse that. If when you study the Bible and you realize, this is not scientific, Genesis 1 is not scientific textbook. the histories recorded in First and Second Samuel and First and Second Kings use the conventions of chroniclers at that time. It's the inspiration is about faith and morality, not about chronology and science and all this kind of thing. And it causes a crisis. And you think, well, and I remember being most people were very sensitive to this, but I remember being kind of bullied by one older man in the church who said, well, if you don't believe in Genesis 1, then you can't believe in John 3:16. You need to choose. If you accept evolution, then you can't. You have no reason to believe in Jesus because you can't believe in original sin, and you can't believe in the authority of Scripture, and da da da. And and this, for an overactive 14-year-old mind, this was a crisis. So I can completely relate to people who want to find in Catholicism a bedrock that is both intellectually coherent and in a sense completely trustworthy and unchangeable. So I truly sympathize with that. The problem is when whatever paradigm someone comes in with. So I'm sort of fleeing a too literalistic fundamentalist reading of Scripture. If you then impose that on the pages of Denzinger, the history of doctrine, you're not actually understanding the Catholic tradition correctly. Something you said, I think, when we were off air that I thought was really beautiful, the image that Bishop Barron gave about the sun. If a 2-year-old asks you about the sun, you say, why does the sun rise? And say, well, God wants us to be warm during the day or wants us to see, And so you can give explanations of the history of Catholic teaching and doctrine that aren't wrong, but they're not the full. But now everyone has all this on the tips of their fingers. They have, when the Pope says something, it's immediately tweeted out by Et Pontifex and millions of journalists. You can Google the history of doctrine. I mean, I don't know how many times I've seen young Catholics on Twitter or Facebook Googling things and coming up with, Boniface VIII and all this stuff and saying, we used to say this and now we say this. And in order to do that responsibly, you have to have lots of theological training. You have to have historical context. And the Catholic faith is not, the vast majority of people should not be expected to parse through 2,000 years of history in multiple contexts and multiple languages and understand all kinds of different theological systems to make sense of this. I mean, what I always come back to with this is, do you as a believing Catholic, hypothetical person, have the tools that you need to grow in your relationship with Christ, to grow within your local community, to have a deeper prayer life? And if the answer to all those things is yes, then keep carrying on. I mean, I don't think young people should be worried about, does John Paul II's statements on non-Christian religions contradict the Council of Florence? I mean, I just don't think that's the most pressing thing, facing their faith life. I think it's more like, how can I grow in my love for my wife or my girlfriend, or how can I be a better son or employee or whatever. How can I love the poor more? And rather than parsing, it's important to debate, if people want to debate the death penalty thing, that's fine. But more important is, what is Jesus calls us to love those who are imprisoned. I mean, are we doing that? I'm not doing that as much as I should. I've spilled a lot more ink on Pope Francis and the death penalty than visiting prisoners in Louisiana. But who has done it is my wife. So my wife I always see as this model Catholic, because she's not even aware of most of these debates. She's a highly educated woman, but not in theology and history. Yeah. And she's the one that's actually visiting the prisoners, not me. So I see it as a kind of rebuke at times of, when we stand before God, He's not going to say, well, great job, Shaun. You won that Facebook argument. You really showed that 17-year-old with the Pepe the Frog. That's all. That stuff's going to get me more purgatory time, probably. But my wife is one who I think in many ways has lived by, the prescriptions of Matthew 25. So she's more Catholic than me in that sense.
Yeah. Man, that resonates with me, Shaun, because my wife is very similar, super smart, super educated, and much holier than I, because I sort of dive into all these intricacies very frequently. And I enjoy talking about them and everything, but I often sort of get too wrapped up in them and forget about the simple task of holiness to which I'm called. And my wife is there just, praying the daily office and doing the rosary and practicing corporal works of mercy all the time. So I'm right there with you. It sounds like the too long didn't read of that answer that you gave is we need to spend less time on Twitter and more time praying and more time reading.
Yes, and I don't mean
more time practicing the faith.
Of course, I don't mean, what you're doing on this channel is a ministry, and that's wonderful, and we need people doing it. There's nothing wrong with talking about these issues and thinking about them and writing about them, but debates about the death penalty need to take a back seat to
totally
to
holiness.
Exactly. And to, ultimately, even if we disagree about this, in principle, hypothetically, could the death penalty be implemented? Everyone needs to be on board with, life from womb to tomb, and taking action in these areas. And I think, to go back to one of your previous questions, all Catholics, wherever we fall on the spectrum, whether we're reading James Martin or Athanasius Schneider, if we can all get on board on what that action is, I think that slowly if we're all growing closer to Christ, kind of like ecumenism, if we're all growing closer to Christ, some of these debates will ultimately melt away. And that will be a very good thing for everyone's salvation, I think.
Yeah. Well, that's a good optimistic note to wrap up with, Shaun. Before we go, though, we didn't even get to talk about the Synod of Pistoia and your book, but I want to give you a chance to just plug that briefly.
Sure. Yeah.
And just give me like a 30-second overview of what the Synod of Pistoia is and what implications it has for Vatican II. And your book, I will once again mention it here, is called The Synod of Pistoia and Vatican II. I assume this was your doctoral dissertation?
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong.
That's right.
Published by Oxford University Press in 2020. So give us the sort of 60-minute plug for that, including the 30-minute. What is the Synod of Pistoia?
Yeah, 30 seconds.
Not 30 minutes, 30 seconds.
Okay, well, it's very complicated historically, but I'll say the relevance that it has is a very concrete case. The relevance for people that are interested in theology. It's a very concrete case of an event in church history which was condemned by the papacy and contained this was a diocesan synod in Italy in 1786, just outside of Florence. It contained all kinds of ideas that Catholics would reject today, by and large, and it contained many ideas that we would accept, by and large. So it's a really interesting test case of a failed reform. So asking, why did this fail? What mistakes did they make, either in their doctrine or in their practice? And then also, how does suppressed ideas make their way kind of back into the bloodstream of the faith? Slowly, carefully, ideas about liturgical reform and the role of the laity and all kinds of stuff, which in many ways come to fruition at Vatican II. What is the healthy way of dealing with rejection by the institutional church? So honestly, some traditionalists might find comfort that ideas that are rather harshly put down can actually, when they're remolded and carefully ironed out, can then get kind of reabsorbed.
Yeah. That sounds really interesting. Yeah, I had not heard of the Synod of Pistoia until I saw an excerpt from your book, and I was like, oh, wow, how have I not heard about this before? How are not more people talking about it?
Pretty much the only people that talk about it are me, some Italian historians, and Archbishop Vigano. So that's pretty much
that's a pretty small list.
Right.
I'm honestly surprised, though, given what you've outlined about it. I'm surprised that not more progressives have grabbed onto that as an example of the sort of what I might call the hermeneutic of rupture.
Right.
Sort of embracing their like revolutionary view. And you obviously have a much more nuanced and I think helpful perspective from that. But I'm surprised that it hasn't entered more of the sort of discourse. You'll see
little asides. It'll get mentioned at times, but I think the main reason was Jansenist became a synonym for like really mean person who's obsessed with hell and doesn't want people to have fun, like kind of how the word Puritan is used as a slur in Protestant circles. So because of that, progressives didn't want their reform identified with this morose, fire and brimstone group, even though I think that's a misreading of certainly where Jansenism developed to. We can talk about that some other time if you want. I mean, it is a fascinating, the development of the kind of Jesuit and Jansenists are locked in ideological combat in the 18th century, and the results of that, I think, have had a huge effect on Catholic doctrine and practice.
And I suspect that sort of understanding the history there has pretty big ecumenical implications.
I think so, yeah.
For our Reformed brethren. So yeah, we should let's schedule another conversation and talk about that.
Yeah, that'd be great, Zach.
Cool. Well, thanks so much for joining me. Where can my listeners follow more of your work, Shaun?
So I have a Twitter handle. I finally broke down and got it. My wife told me that I would be in purgatory for the rest of time if I got it. But it's at Shaun L. Blanchard. And I have an academia.edu page. If you Google me, you'll find that, which has links to everything that I have that's just available on the internet. I have a number of articles in the Church Life Journal, Notre Dame's Church Life Journal. And if you want to read the 2,000 or 3,000 word thing on Jansenism instead of the 100,000 word thing, you can do it on the Church Life Journal website. So, which I presume 99.9% of people would prefer the 2,000 to 3,000 word account, which is that's how these academic monographs go.
Yeah, that's true. Well, thanks so much, Shaun. And to my listeners, I'm going to try to put all those show notes, all those links in the show notes below. Thanks so much for joining another episode.
Thank you, Zach. It was a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And if my listeners want some questions from Shaun answered, I'd be happy to forward those along to him. So just send me a note, Zach@credopodcast.com. And until next time, God bless you.